The throne room of the Valanthi Empire stretched upward like a frozen dream, its walls made of living crystal that hummed with ancient light. Emperor Soroth Velkan sat upon his throne of woven starlight, his silver skin reflecting the glow of 1,000 captured nebulae, and his eyes, those shifting pools of cosmic color, held a wariness that no amount of imperial dignity could hide. His empire was dying. For 300 years, the devourer swarm had crawled across the galaxy like a plague of living nightmares. They were not a species in any way the Valanthi understood. They were hunger given form, biomechanical horrors that consumed worlds and turned the remains into more of themselves. Every fleet the Emperor sent against them returned as wreckage, and every world they touched became dust and screaming silence. The Valanthi were an ancient people, proud and graceful, their civilization stretching back 50,000 years. They had mastered arts and sciences that younger races could barely imagine. But they had forgotten how to fight wars of desperation, wars where survival meant throwing yourself into the fire again and again, until either you or your enemy stopped breathing. And so Emperor Soroth had done something his ancestors would have considered unthinkable. He had asked the humans for help. Humans, the youngest species in the Galactic Compact, barely 3 centuries removed from their first stumbling steps into space. They came from a world so hostile that other species called it a death planet, a place of crushing gravity and wild weather and predators that hunted for sport. They lived such brief lives, burning through their decades like matches struck in darkness. Yet somehow they had clawed their way to the stars with bloody determination and refused to be ignored. The Emperor had expected the humans to send a fleet, perhaps a grand armada to match the scale of the threat. Instead, they sent one ship. The human frigate that dropped out of warp above the Valanthi homeworld was small and ugly by imperial standards. A brutal wedge of gray metal covered in scars and welded patches that spoke of battles survived through sheer stubbornness. It carried no elegant curves, no artistic flourishes, nothing but weapons and armor and the promise of violence. And from that ship came Commander Marcus Cole. He walked into the throne room like a man who had seen too much death to be impressed by living crystal and captured starlight. His face was weathered and worn, marked by scars that traced stories of pain across his features. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they held a weight that seemed far too heavy for someone so young by Valanthi standards. He was only 47 human years old, barely a heartbeat in the lifespan of the Emperor's people. Behind him marched 200 soldiers, in heavy armor, painted the black of deep space. The Helldivers, the humans called them, their most elite warriors, men and women who had volunteered to fall from the sky into the worst battles humanity had ever known, and somehow survived. Emperor Soroth, Marcus said, his voice rough like gravel scraping stone. You asked for warriors who know how to fight monsters. We have come to answer that call. The Emperor studied this human with ancient eyes. He saw the weariness, the grief, the countless losses that had carved themselves into the man's soul. But he also saw something else, a fire that refused to die, a stubborn flame that burned even in the darkest night. You bring only 200 soldiers and one small ship, the Emperor said, and yet you speak as though you can turn the tide of this war. Marcus did not smile. His expression remained as hard as iron. Your fleets fight with precision and grace, Your Majesty. They follow battle plans that were written 10,000 years ago. But the swarm does not care about your traditions or your elegant maneuvers. They only know how to overwhelm and consume. He stepped forward, and the Imperial guards tensed, but the Emperor raised one silver hand to still them. My people learned to fight on a world that wanted us dead from the moment we were born, Marcus continued, and we learned one truth above all others. Sometimes the only way to survive is to be more stubborn than death itself. Within 1 week, Marcus Cole proved his words were not empty boasts. 3 Valanthe colony worlds stood on the edge of annihilation, their orbital defenses shattered, and their populations huddled in underground bunkers, waiting for the end. The Imperial commanders had written them off as lost causes, acceptable sacrifices in a war of attrition. Marcus refused to accept that. He took his single frigate and his 200 Helldivers, and he did something the Valanthe had never considered. He attacked the swarm's supply lines. Not their warriors, not their hive ships, but the smaller vessels that carried nutrients and biomass to feed the endless hunger of the horde. The swarm was not intelligent in the way that other species understood intelligence. They did not plan, or strategize, or adapt with creative thinking. They simply consumed and multiplied according to patterns written into their genetic code. And Marcus Cole had recognized this weakness. "Starve the beast," he told his soldiers as they prepared for another impossible mission, "and even the mightiest monster will falter." The swarm forces around the 3 colony worlds began to slow, then to weaken, then to fragment, as their central coordination broke down from lack of resources. And in that moment of confusion, the Valanthe fleet struck with renewed fury. 3 worlds saved in 7 days, and suddenly the entire galaxy was watching this strange human warrior with new eyes. Emperor Soraf summoned Marcus to the throne room once more, and this time the Emperor did not sit upon his throne looking down at a petitioner. Instead, he rose and walked down the crystal steps to stand face to face with the human commander. "You have given my people something they had lost," the Emperor said, "and for this gift, I wish to offer you one in return." Marcus said nothing, waiting with the patience of a man who had learned to expect nothing good from fate. "My daughter," the Emperor declared, "Princess Alindra Velkan. I offer her hand in marriage to you, Commander Cole, to bind our peoples in an alliance that will endure for eternity." The words echoed through the throne room like thunder, and somewhere in the shadows beyond the great crystal pillars, a figure froze in shock. Princess Alindra had come to watch this strange human warrior, curious about the creature who had accomplished what entire Valanthe armadas could not. She was tall and graceful like all her people, her silver skin shimmering with inner light, her eyes pools of swirling violet and gold. She had lived for nearly 3,000 years and had learned to school her features into perfect imperial calm. But now her twin hearts pounded in her chest with something she did not understand. Marcus Cole was silent for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes distant with thoughts he did not share. Alindra watched him from the shadows and wondered what such a brief and brutal creature could possibly be thinking. Finally, he spoke. "I accept." The words were simple, without ceremony or passion. He did not speak of honor or gratitude or love. He spoke like a man signing a treaty, agreeing to terms that would serve a greater purpose. "The alliance will save billions of lives," he said, "and that is worth any price." Alindra felt something twist in her chest. Was it disappointment that he had not spoken of wanting her? Or relief that this marriage would be a political arrangement, rather than something more complicated? She only knew that her father had chosen this human warrior to be her eternal partner, and her life would never be the same. As Marcus turned to leave the throne room, his eyes swept across the shadows where she stood. For one brief moment, their gazes met, storm gray meeting violet gold, and Alindra felt a shock run through her like lightning. Then he was gone, and she was left alone with her racing hearts and a future she had never imagined. The war was not over. The swarm still threatened everything her people had built. But now there was hope, carried in the calloused hands of a human warrior who had agreed to marry a princess he had never met. And Princess Alindra Velkan, daughter of emperors and heir to 50,000 years of tradition, found herself thinking about storm-gray eyes long into the night. 6 months had passed since the day Emperor Sorath offered his daughter to the human warrior, and the war had become a grinding storm of blood and fire across 100 star systems. Princess Aelindra stood on the bridge of the fortress station orbiting Thesara Prime, watching the swarm of enemy ships that darkened the stars like a living cloud. The Devourer swarm had thrown everything they had at this world, for Thesara Prime was the gateway to the Inner Empire. If it fell, nothing would stop the Horde from reaching the homeworld itself. Her father had sent her here with a simple order: serve as diplomatic liaison to Commander Marcus Cole, observe his methods, and learn why humans fought so differently from her own people. She had expected to hate him. Everything she had been taught about humans suggested they were barely more than clever animals, short-lived, emotional, driven by instinct rather than reason. They made decisions based on feelings, rather than careful analysis. They formed attachments that clouded their judgment. They were, in the words of her tutors, dangerously unpredictable. But the man she had come to know over these 6 months was nothing like the creature her education had prepared her for. On her first night, aboard the command station, she had found Marcus alone in an observation room, reading from a data tablet while the stars burned cold beyond the windows. She had approached quietly, curious about what might capture a warrior's attention between battles. Valanthi poetry, ancient verses written by masters who had died before humanity's ancestors had learned to make fire. "You read our language?" she had said, unable to hide her surprise. Marcus had looked up at her with those storm-gray eyes, and she had seen something unexpected in their depths. Not the cold calculation of a war machine, but genuine warmth and wonder. "Your poets understood something that my people are still learning," he had answered. "They knew how to find beauty in the darkness between stars. When I read their words, I remember why we are fighting." That was the first crack in the wall of her expectations. Over the weeks that followed, Aelindra watched Marcus Cole command his forces with a strange mix of brutal efficiency and profound compassion. He drove his soldiers hard, demanded excellence that bordered on impossible, and never accepted excuses for failure. But she also saw him weep. She found him one night in the medical bay, sitting beside a young helldiver who had been torn apart by swarm creatures during a boarding action. The soldier was dying, and Marcus held his hand like a father comforting a child. "You did good, son," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking with grief. "You held the line when it mattered. Your family will know what you did here. I will tell them myself." The young soldier smiled, squeezed his commander's hand, and closed his eyes for the last time. Aelindra watched as Marcus sat in silence for a long moment, tears tracking down his weathered face. Then he stood, wiped his eyes, and walked back to the command center to continue the war. She had never seen a Valanthi commander show such emotion. It was considered weakness, a failure of discipline. But watching Marcus, she began to wonder if her people had been wrong. The siege of Thesara Prime grew worse with each passing day. The swarm threw wave after wave of creatures at the orbital defenses, and the fortress station shuddered under impacts that never seemed to end. Valanthi commanders urged retreat, argued that the world was lost, that they should fall back and regroup. Marcus refused. "There are 12 million civilians on the surface," he said, his voice hard as iron, "and evacuation transports that need 18 more hours to finish loading. We hold the line." 18 hours. The Valanthi admirals looked at each other with despair. Holding for 18 more hours against this onslaught was suicide. But Marcus did not ask his soldiers to do anything he would not do himself. Aelindra watched in horror as he sealed himself into his battle armor and led a counterattack against a swarm boarding party that had breached the station's outer hull. She followed the battle through security cameras, her twin hearts pounding as she watched this human fight with a ferocity that took her breath away. He was everywhere at once, shooting, stabbing, throwing swarm creatures aside with his bare hands when his weapons ran dry. His armor cracked and split under the assault, and she could see blood seeping through the gaps, but he never stopped moving, never stopped fighting. Hour after hour, he held that breach. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found him standing alone in a corridor filled with swarm corpses, his broken armor sparking and failing, his body held upright by nothing but willpower. Alindra was there when he collapsed. She caught him as his legs gave out, and his weight pulled them both to the floor. His blood, red, so startlingly red compared to the silver that ran in her own veins, spread across her gown, and she did not care. "The transports," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Did they make it?" "They made it," she told him, holding him close as medics rushed to help. "All of them because of you." He smiled then, a small, tired, beautiful smile that lit up his broken face. "Good," he said, "that is good." Then his eyes closed, and she thought for one terrible moment that he had died in her arms. But Marcus Cole was not ready to die, not yet. He woke 3 days later in a medical pod, his body rebuilt by Valanthi healing technology that was far beyond anything human science could achieve. Alindra was there when his eyes opened, and the first thing he did was ask about his soldiers, about the battle, about the civilians they had saved. She told him everything. She told him that Thessara Prime still stood, that the swarm had been pushed back, that his impossible stand had become a legend that spread across the Empire like wildfire. "Why?" she asked him when she had finished, her voice trembling with emotions she did not fully understand. "Why did you do it? You nearly died. You should have retreated when the admirals told you to." Marcus looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and she felt her heart skip. "Because they needed more time," he said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the universe. That was the moment Princess Alindra Velkan realized she was falling in love with a human. The thought terrified her. For 3,000 years, she had been taught that love was a weakness, a corruption that destroyed royal bloodlines and brought empires to ruin. Valanthi marriages were political arrangements, carefully negotiated alliances that served the greater good of the people. Emotion had no place in such unions, but when she looked at Marcus Cole, this strange, brief, impossibly brave creature, she felt something stirring in her chest that all her training could not suppress. She began to find excuses to be near him. She sat with him during meals, asking questions about human culture and listening with genuine fascination to his answers. She walked with him through the station's corridors, learning about his past, his dreams, his fears. He told her about Earth, about blue skies and green forests and oceans that stretched to the horizon. He told her about the wars that had scarred his people and forged them into something harder than steel. He told her about loss, a wife and daughter he had loved and buried, ghosts that still haunted his dreams. "Does it ever stop hurting?" she asked him one night as they watched the stars through an observation window. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "No," he finally said, "but you learn to carry it. The pain becomes part of you, and eventually you realize that the pain is just love, with nowhere to go." Alindra felt tears prick at her eyes, silver tears that she quickly blinked away. She was falling, and she did not know how to stop. But deep in her heart, a voice whispered warnings that she could not ignore. Marcus was human. He would live perhaps another 50 years if he was lucky, while she would endure for millennia. To love him was to sign herself up for an eternity of grief. And yet, watching him smile as he pointed out constellations that reminded him of home, she could not bring herself to pull away. The war continued, but Princess Alindra had already begun fighting a different battle, a battle against her own heart. Across 100 star systems, the Devourer swarm was being pushed back by tactics that no Valanthi commander would have ever imagined. Marcus Cole had taught the Imperial fleet something they had forgotten over millennia of graceful warfare. How to fight dirty, how to strike without honor, how to survive when survival seemed impossible. The humans called it adaptation. They said it was the gift their death world had given them, the ability to change and evolve and overcome obstacles that should have crushed them into dust. Where Volanthi tradition demanded elegance, human instinct demanded results. And the results were undeniable. The swarm's advance had not just been stopped, it was being reversed. Colony worlds that had been given up for lost were being liberated, their populations emerging from underground shelters to find human soldiers standing guard against the darkness. Songs were being written about the Helldivers, epic poems that spoke of these short-lived warriors who threw themselves into fire without hesitation. But as the military situation improved, the political situation grew darker. Princess Aelindra stood in the great council chamber of the Imperial Palace, watching the high conclave of noble houses gather like storm clouds preparing to unleash thunder. These were the oldest and most powerful families in the Empire, bloodlines that stretched back to the founding of Volanthi civilization, and they were furious. "This marriage cannot be allowed to proceed," Lord Vethran declared, his silver face twisted with disgust. "The human is a useful tool, nothing more. To bind the imperial bloodline to such a creature is an insult to our ancestors." Lady Mirsha nodded in agreement, her nebula eyes flashing with cold fire. "The humans are too short-lived," she said. "The princess will watch him wither and die before she has barely begun to know him. And what then? Will she mourn for centuries? Will she become one of those tragic figures from the old stories, destroyed by grief? Worse than that," another lord added, his voice dripping with venom. "The humans are emotional creatures. They form attachments that override their judgment. They love." He spoke the word like it was a curse. "If the princess bonds with this human, truly bonds with him, she will be corrupted. She will begin to think like them, to feel like them. The imperial bloodline will be tainted with their weakness." Aelindra listened to their arguments with a face as calm as frozen starlight, but inside she was screaming. They did not understand. They had never sat with Marcus Cole as he read poetry, never watched him weep for fallen soldiers, never seen the impossible fire that burned in his soul. They saw only a short-lived alien from a savage world, not the man who had saved their empire. But she could not defend him, not here, not now. To speak in his favor would only confirm their suspicions that she had already been corrupted by human emotion. Emperor Sorath raised one hand, and the chamber fell silent. "The marriage will proceed as planned," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "The alliance with humanity has saved us from extinction. Commander Cole has earned this honor 1,000 times over." The nobles bowed their heads in submission, but Aelindra could see the anger simmering behind their eyes. They would obey, but they would never accept. And she knew that if she gave them any reason to believe she had feelings for Marcus, they would use it against both of them. Later that night, alone in her chambers, Aelindra finally allowed herself to face the truth. She loved him. It was not a gradual realization. It was a flood that had been building behind a dam of denial, and now that dam had shattered. She loved his courage and his compassion. She loved the way he smiled when he talked about Earth. She loved the sadness in his eyes and the strength that refused to let that sadness consume him. She loved a human, and the thought filled her with terror. The conclave was right about one thing. Humans loved with a ferocity that her people could not match. They burned themselves alive for those they cherished, threw away their brief lives without hesitation for the ones they loved. It was beautiful and terrible and utterly alien to everything she had been taught. And she had seen what that love did to them when it ended. She thought of Marcus's wife and daughter, the family he had lost in the wars that scarred his world. She had seen the way his eyes went dark when he spoke of them. The grief that still lived in his heart after so many years. He carried that pain like a wound that would never heal. And yet he had loved again. He had opened himself to the possibility of new loss without hesitation. How could anyone be so brave? How could anyone choose to love, knowing that love would eventually destroy them? Alindra walked to her window and stared out at the stars. She would live for 10,000 more years, perhaps longer. If she allowed herself to love Marcus, truly love him, she would watch him age and die in what would feel like the blink of an eye. And then she would be alone with her grief for millennia, carrying the memory of storm-gray eyes and a tired smile through centuries of empty nights. The conclave called human love a weakness, but Alindra was beginning to understand that it was something far more dangerous than that. Human love was a fire that could not be controlled. It did not follow rules or respect boundaries or care about consequences. It simply burned, and it burned everything it touched, and the humans embraced it anyway, because they had decided that the warmth was worth the destruction. Could she do the same? Could she become like them, a creature of passion and pain, willing to sacrifice her peace for moments of connection that would fade like stars at dawn? The eve of the formal betrothal ceremony arrived, and Alindra had still not found her answer. She stood in her chambers, wearing the traditional gown of silver starlight that had been passed down through generations of Volanthi princesses, and she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was calm, her posture perfect, every inch the imperial heir she had been raised to be. But her hearts were at war. One part of her wanted to walk into that ceremony and accept Marcus Cole as her partner, to let herself fall into the fire of human love and burn alongside him for whatever time they had together. That part whispered that the conclave was wrong, that love was not weakness, but the greatest strength any being could possess. The other part screamed warnings of grief and loss and endless lonely centuries. That part reminded her of the tragic figures from Volanthi history, the princes and princesses who had loved too deeply and been shattered when that love was taken from them. Some had gone mad. Some had ended their own lives. All of them had served as cautionary tales for generation after generation of royal children. Do not love, her mother had told her when she was young. Love is for common people who do not carry the weight of empires. You must be stronger than that. Alindra had believed those words for 3,000 years. But now, standing on the edge of a moment that would define the rest of her existence, she did not know what to believe anymore. A soft chime announced a visitor at her door. She composed herself and called for them to enter. It was Marcus. He wore ceremonial armor forged by Volanthi artisans. Beautiful work that transformed him from a battle-scarred warrior into something almost elegant. But his eyes were the same, storm-gray and tired and impossibly kind. "I wanted to see you before the ceremony," he said quietly. "I wanted to tell you that I understand." Alindra felt her heart stop. Understand what? Marcus smiled, that sad, gentle smile that made her soul ache. "I have been watching you, princess. I have seen the war in your eyes, the battle you have been fighting against yourself. You are afraid." She wanted to deny it, to maintain the imperial mask she had worn for thousands of years. But she could not lie to him, not to those eyes that had seen too much death to be fooled by pretty masks. "Yes," she whispered, "I am afraid." Marcus nodded slowly. "So am I," he said. "I have loved before, and I have lost. I know the price. But tomorrow I will stand in that chamber and offer you my heart anyway, because that is what humans do. We love despite the fear, not because the fear is gone." He reached out and took her hand, a breach of protocol that would have scandalized the conclave. And his touch was warm and rough and impossibly gentle. Whatever you decide tomorrow, Aelindra, I want you to know that I will not hold it against you. You must choose what is right for yourself, not what is right for the Alliance, or the Empire, or me. Then he released her hand, bowed with surprising grace, and left. Aelindra stood alone, her hand still warm where he had touched it, and she finally understood the impossible truth. She was going to break his heart tomorrow, and her own, because she loved him too much to destroy herself, and she was not brave enough to burn. The Garden of Eternal Stars had been the site of royal betrothals for 20,000 years. It was not truly a garden in any normal sense. It was a dome of living crystal that captured and held the light of distant suns, creating a ceiling of frozen fire that stretched overhead like a map of forever. Flowers from 1,000 worlds grew in carefully tended beds, their colors impossible, and their fragrances sweet enough to make visitors weep. It was the most beautiful place in the entire Valanthi Empire, and today it was filled with the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Nobles from every great house stood in perfect formation, their silver faces carefully neutral as they watched the ceremony unfold. Ambassadors from allied species whispered to each other behind raised hands. Human generals, in their dress uniforms, stood at attention, representing the alliance that had saved the Empire from destruction. And at the center of it all stood Marcus Cole. He wore the ceremonial armor that Valanthi craftsmen had forged for him. Elegant silver plate, inscribed with patterns that told the story of his victories, his sacrifices, his impossible courage. He looked almost like one of them, almost like a being who belonged among the stars. But his eyes betrayed him, those storm-gray human eyes that held too much warmth, too much hope, too much of everything that made his species so dangerous and so beautiful. Princess Aelindra walked toward him down an aisle of crystallized moonlight, and every step felt like a mile. She had not slept. She had spent the entire night staring at the stars, fighting a battle that had no winning side. Her heart ached with love for the man waiting at the altar, and her mind screamed warnings of the destruction that love would bring. She was torn apart, shattered inside, and no one could see it behind the perfect mask of her imperial composure. The ceremony began with ancient words spoken by the High Priest of the Eternal Flame, words that had bound Valanthi royalty for millennia. They spoke of duty and alliance, of bloodlines preserved and empires strengthened. Not once did they mention love. Love had no place in Valanthi tradition. And then it was time for the acceptance. The High Priest turned to Marcus first, as was custom. The offering party must confirm their commitment before the receiving party could respond. Marcus Cole of Earth, the priest intoned, do you offer yourself to House Velkan to serve as partner and ally for as long as the stars burn? Marcus looked at Aelindra, and his eyes were soft with something that made her heart break. I do, he said, his rough voice steady and certain. The priest turned to Aelindra. Princess Aelindra Velkan, do you accept this offering, binding yourself to this union for as long as the stars burn? The chamber fell silent. 1,000 eyes watched her. The future of two species hung on her next words. Aelindra opened her mouth to speak, and the words that came out were not the ones she had planned. I reject this union. Gasps erupted through the garden like explosions. The nobles stirred in shock, their careful neutrality shattered. The human generals exchanged confused glances. Only Marcus remained still, his expression unchanged, though Aelindra saw something die in his eyes, a light going out, a hope collapsing into ash. She could have stopped there. She could have left it as a simple political rejection, and walked away with her dignity intact. But she owed him more than that. She owed him the truth. "I reject this union," she continued, her voice trembling as tears began to stream down her silver cheeks. "But not because you are unworthy, Marcus Cole." The chamber grew even more silent, if that was possible. "I reject you because you are too worthy. I reject you because I have come to know you over these months. And what I have found is not the savage creature I expected. I have found a man who reads poetry to calm his soul before battle. I have found a warrior who weeps for every soldier he loses. I have found a heart so vast and so brave that it humbles everything I thought I knew about courage." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. "I reject you because I love you, Marcus Cole, and love is not something my people survive." The nobles were stunned into absolute stillness. No one had ever spoken of love at a Volanthi betrothal. It was unthinkable, scandalous, revolutionary. "Humans live such brief lives," Alindra said, her tears falling faster now, "and yet you pack those lives so full of passion and connection that they burn brighter than our millennia. But I will outlive you by thousands of years. If I allow myself to love you completely, to burn the way your people burn, then I will spend those thousands of years drowning in grief." She took a shuddering breath. "I am a coward," she whispered. "I am choosing duty over my heart, because my heart would destroy me. I am choosing the cold safety of tradition over the beautiful fire that you offer. And I am sorry. I am so sorry that I am not brave enough to be human." The confession hung in the air like smoke, and Alindra waited for Marcus to react, to rage, to plead, to turn away in disgust at her weakness. But Marcus Cole did something that no one in that chamber expected. He smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was sad and gentle and full of understanding. The smile of a man who had seen too much loss to be surprised by more. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and every guard in the room tensed. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. A breach of protocol so severe that half the nobles looked ready to faint. "I know," he said softly, his voice meant only for her. "I have known for weeks. I saw it in your eyes every time you looked at me, the love and the fear, the hope and the despair. I watched you fight yourself, and I understood." Alindra stared at him through her tears. "You knew, and you still came here today?" "I came here because I wanted you to have the chance to choose," Marcus said. "I wanted you to speak your truth, whatever that truth might be, and you have." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss against her silver skin, a human gesture, impossibly tender, utterly foreign to Volanthi custom. "I have loved exactly twice in my life, Alindra. Both times it ended in grief so vast that I thought I would never breathe again. I lost my wife to a war that should never have been fought. I lost my daughter to a sickness that human medicine could not cure. And for years afterward, I wished that I had never loved them at all, because the pain was too much to bear." His storm-gray eyes held hers, and she saw the ancient wounds that still lived there. "But I was wrong," he continued. "I would do it all over. Every moment with them, every memory, every laugh and every tear. I would choose it again and again, because that is what love is. It is not a contract or an alliance or a political arrangement. It is a choice to hold something precious, knowing that it will slip away." He released her hand and stepped back. "You are afraid of becoming human," he said, "afraid of burning the way we burn. But Alindra, you already are human in the way that matters. You have already begun to love, and that is not a weakness. That is the most courageous thing any being can be." He bowed then, not the formal bow of a subject to royalty, but a deep and genuine bow of respect from one soul to another. "I hope that someday you find the courage to burn," he said, "whether it is with me or with someone else, because a life without love is safe, but it is not living. Then Commander Marcus Cole, the human warrior who had saved an empire and lost a princess, turned and walked away. The nobles parted before him in stunned silence. The human generals fell into step behind him, their faces grim but proud, and the entire Garden of Eternal Stars watched as the bravest man most of them had ever seen disappeared through the crystal doors without looking back. Alindra stood alone at the altar, her silver gown stained with tears, her hearts shattered into pieces that she did not know how to reassemble. She had done what she set out to do. She had protected herself from the fire of human love. She had chosen the cold safety of duty over the burning passion that Marcus offered. She had been wise and careful and sensible. So why did she feel like she had just made the worst mistake of her eternal life? The ceremony was over. The nobles began to whisper among themselves, already spinning this scandal into political advantage. The high priest quietly withdrew, his ancient face troubled by words he had never expected to hear in this sacred place. And Princess Alindra Velkan collapsed to her knees in the Garden of Eternal Stars, sobbing as the captured sunlight above her seemed to dim. She had rejected the human warrior her father chose, but she had also rejected the only being in the universe who had ever made her feel truly alive. And she did not know if she would ever forgive herself. 1 year had passed since the rejection, and the galaxy was burning. The Devourer swarm had gathered everything they had for one final assault, a living armada so vast that it blotted out the stars, aimed directly at the Valanthi homeworld. Scout ships reported high fleets beyond counting, millions of biomechanical nightmares screaming through the void with one purpose: the complete annihilation of everything the Empire had built. And at the heart of this impossible swarm floated the Hive Queen herself. She was not a creature. She was a world, a moon-sized intelligence of twisted flesh and corrupted metal, the central mind that controlled every devourer in existence. For centuries, the Valanthi had dreamed of destroying her, knowing that her death would cause the entire swarm to collapse into chaos. But no weapon they possessed could penetrate her defenses, and no fleet could get close enough to try. The combined forces of the Galactic Compact gathered to make their final stand. Valanthi warships with their elegant curves and ancient weapons, human battlecruisers with their brutal armor and devastating firepower, allied vessels from a dozen species who had all felt the swarm's hunger. They were outnumbered 10-1, but they had no choice. If they fell here, civilization itself would die. Commander Marcus Cole stood on the bridge of his flagship, the same scarred frigate that had carried him to the Valanthi homeworld a lifetime ago. His face was older now, more weathered, marked by a year of constant warfare. But his storm-gray eyes still held that impossible fire, that stubborn refusal to surrender that defined his entire species. And somewhere across the void, aboard her own warship, Princess Alindra watched his vessel on her tactical display and felt her heart's ache with familiar pain. She had changed in the year since the rejection. She had refused 3 politically advantageous betrothals, shocking the conclave into silence. She had trained in combat and strategy, earning command of her own warship through merit rather than birth. She had become a warrior princess, fighting alongside the soldiers she had once looked down upon. But she had never spoken to Marcus Cole again. She saw him sometimes across crowded command centers, caught glimpses of him in battle reports and strategic briefings. Each time, she felt the wound in her heart tear open fresh. She had done the right thing, the safe thing. And yet every day, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Now, watching his ship hold formation against the approaching apocalypse, she wondered if this would be the last time she ever saw him. The battle began with fire and fury beyond description. Swarm creatures poured toward the Allied fleet like a tide of living death, and the defenders answered with everything they had. Energy beams carved through the void. Missiles detonated in blossoms of nuclear fire. Smaller ships darted and weaved through the chaos, fighting desperate holding actions against enemies that never stopped coming. Marcus Cole was everywhere, his voice calm and steady on the command channel, coordinating attacks and rallying broken formations. He moved his frigate into impossible positions, plugging gaps in the line that should have been impossible to hold. Time and again, he saved ships that should have been lost, turned defeats into stalemates, and stalemates into fragile victories. But it was not enough. The Hive Queen advanced through the carnage, her massive form surrounded by layers of defenders so thick that no attack could reach her. Allied ships threw themselves against her shields and were swatted aside like insects. The greatest weapons in the Galactic Compact barely scratched her armored hide. Alindra heard the despair growing in the voices on the command channel. Admirals spoke of retreat. Captains begged for orders that would never come. The battle was lost. Everyone knew it. And yet they fought on because there was nowhere left to run. And then Marcus Cole made his decision. All Helldivers, abandon ship. His voice came across the fleet-wide channel, impossibly calm. Fall back to the nearest Allied vessels. That is a direct order. She watched on her display as escape pods erupted from his frigate, his soldiers fleeing the ship they had called home. Within minutes, the vessel was empty, except for a single life sign on the bridge. "Marcus, what are you doing?" she heard herself scream across the comm. His voice came back warm and tired, and full of something she did not want to name. "What I should have done a long time ago, Alindra. I have calculated the trajectory. If I pilot my ship directly into the Hive Queen's core and detonate the experimental singularity drive we have been carrying, it will create a collapse that will tear her apart from the inside." "That is suicide," she choked out. "No," Marcus answered. "It is love." His frigate broke formation and accelerated toward the Hive Queen. Defense ships tried to intercept him, but the human vessel was fast, and its pilot knew every trick that desperation could teach. He weaved through enemy fire with impossible skill, getting closer and closer to the nightmare at the heart of the swarm. Alindra watched in horror, her silver hands gripping her command console until her knuckles ached. "Marcus, please," she begged. "There has to be another way." "There is not," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "And even if there was, I would still do this. Do you want to know why?" She could not answer. Her throat had closed around words that would not come. "Because you taught me something, Alindra. You showed me that the Velanthi way, duty over love, has its own kind of courage. You were not a coward when you rejected me. You were trying to protect yourself from pain that you did not think you could survive. I understand that. I respect that." His ship was almost there now, diving through the last layers of defenders. "But I am human," Marcus continued, "and humans choose love over everything, even death. I am not dying for the galaxy, Alindra. I am dying so that you get to live in it, so that you have the chance to find your own fire, your own love, your own reason to burn." Tears streamed down Alindra's face, silver rivers of grief that she could not stop. "That is not sacrifice," Marcus said, his voice growing soft. "That is just love." His ship vanished into the Hive Queen's core. For one terrible moment, silence fell across the battlefield. Alindra stopped breathing. Every being in the fleet held their hope and terror in their hearts. And then the Hive Queen exploded. A new sun bloomed in the void, brilliant and terrible and beautiful, as the singularity drive tore apart the central intelligence of the Devourer swarm. The massive creature disintegrated in a cascade of fire and force that spread outward in an expanding ring of destruction. The swarm went mad. Without the Hive Queen to guide them, The creatures lost all coordination. They turned on each other, attacked empty space, flew into stars and asteroids. The greatest threat the galaxy had ever known collapsed into chaos in a matter of minutes. And Commander Marcus Cole, the human warrior who had saved an empire and loved a princess, was gone. Alindra floated alone on her bridge, tears falling in silver streams, as the galaxy was saved by the most human act imaginable. 300 years later, Empress Alindra Velkan stood on a small blue-green world called Earth. She had changed so much since that terrible day. She had become the first ruler to openly speak of love in the Valanthi court. She had reformed the ancient marriage laws. She had taught her people that emotions were not weaknesses to be suppressed, but strengths to be embraced. She had loved again, not like she had loved Marcus, but in her own way, at her own pace. She had lost those loves too, one by one, as mortal lives faded around her. And yes, it hurt. It hurt more than she had ever imagined. But Marcus had been right. The pain was worth it. Every moment of connection was worth the grief that followed. She walked through a quiet garden to a statue that stood at its center. A tired soldier carved in stone, holding a book of poetry and looking up at the stars. Flowers from 100 worlds grew around its base, tended by Valanthi pilgrims who came to honor the human who had saved their civilization. Alindra placed her hand on the cold stone and smiled through her tears. "You were right," she whispered. "Love does not make us weak. It makes us human, and that was always the point, was it not?" She laughed then, her first real laugh in 300 years, and the sound carried across the garden like music. "I burned, Marcus. I burned the way you told me to, and it was beautiful." She stood there for a long time, hand pressed against the statue's chest, remembering a man who had taught an immortal princess how to truly live. The stars above her sparkled like captured fire, and Princess Alindra Velkan, empress of a changed civilization, survivor of 1,000 griefs, and keeper of a human heart, finally understood what it meant to be brave. Not the absence of fear, not the denial of pain, but the courage to love anyway. And somewhere across the vast gulf of time and space, she could have sworn she heard a rough voice laughing with her, proud and warm, and full of stubborn human hope.